The public latrines in Roman antiquity were in large rooms, and around three sides of the room were set a deep channel with flowing water. And over top of that deep channel were the marble slabs with a keyhole-shaped seat for each user. There were no doors, there were no cubicles, there's no curtains in between the users, and so it looks very much like the Roman toilet user sat and defecated in full view of everyone else using the Roman toilet, which seems incredible to us, but Romans don't seem to have had the same need for privacy in this type of activity that we do. The latrines that we found, the public latrines, the multi-seater public latrines, seat between 8 and 80 people. So there could be quite a crowd in the room when you went in to do your business. In front of the latrine itself, there was a shallow gutter, which also had flowing water in it. And this was used to rinse out your sponge-topped stick, which is what the Romans used for toilet paper. So when you were done your business, you leaned forward and you got your stick topped with the sponge, and you used it to clean yourself, and then you rinsed it off in the water in the shallow gutter at your feet, and then you put it back in the pile for the next Roman to use, which is terribly unsanitary, but the Romans don't seem to have had the same kinds of hygiene standards that we do. In private houses, the toilets were little more than cesspits. The Latin word for that is puteus, and they were situated in or near the kitchen. So the cesspit was just a very large hole dug into the ground, into which was dumped the contents of chamber pots, food scraps, all kinds of other scraps. Often there was a single-seater latrine built over the big hole. The cesspit was not connected to the sewer. They often drain into other sorts of places. So one cesspit we know of drained into the street, another drains into the garden, which is not only malodorous, but it's also dangerous because the garden is where the Romans grew food for human consumption. And if it's in constant contact with human waste, that is definitely not up to modern hygiene standards. Now, the cesspits that we have discovered have been dug into tufa, which is a very porous rock, and that would take care of the liquids. They would just be absorbed by the rock. But the solids needed to be cleared away periodically. And there were men you could hire to come and clear out your cesspit. They were called stercorarii, and they sold the contents as fertilizer. And in fact, in the ancient world, human waste was the most prevalent item that farmers used as fertilizer. If you were in an apartment, you might be so lucky as to have a drop toilet, which have only very recently been identified by archaeologists. And a drop toilet is where there's a little niche in the wall, and there's with a little seat on it. And there were pipes leading down from the niche down into the lower part of the house. And so what you could crawl into the niche and do your business, and the waste would be carried away down the pipes down into the lower part of the house. So it was like a bit like a mail chute or a laundry chute. There are several reasons why people did not connect their cesspit to the sewer system when they legally could have, so it does seem incredible. But there are some problems with connecting your cesspit to the sewer system. The first is that when the sewers backed up due to river risings or blockages, you would suddenly have a bunch of raw sewage in your kitchen, so that's not good. In addition, the water that would come up during that same situation could seriously undermine housing foundations, which in many Roman houses were never very solid anyway, so that's another thing that you don't want. In addition, there was some fear that vermin could crawl up into the house through the sewer connection. And there is one wonderful story in a Roman historian about a small octopus that crawls through the sewer and up through a house drain into the kitchen every night to eat the pickled octopus that's stored there. The Romans used chamber pots as well as public or private latrines, and the Latin word for chamber pot generally is metella, but they had different kinds of chamber pots for the two sexes, which I think is just so interesting. So men used a flagon-shaped chamber pot, and women used a boat-shaped chamber pot. Now that was for urination. The Romans had an entirely different chamber pot for defecation. And again, these have only recently been identified in archaeological remains. They had been misidentified for decades. In our ancient novel by Petronius called the Satyricon, the character Trimalchio has a very elaborate chamber pot setup. He has a whole bunch of chamber pots in the dining room for use in urination. But he says to his guests, if anything else comes on, you can leave the dining room. I've got a whole bunch of other chamber pots set up outside with little pots of water and all the comforts. And he urges his guests not to hold anything in. He thinks it's very unhealthy. This is the same character who has a slave follow him around at the baths with a chamber pot at the ready so that Trimalchio won't have to use the public latrine, which was often connected to the baths. One assumes that it was the job of a slave in the Roman household to collect all the chamber pots from the various rooms and dump them into the cesspit in the kitchen. Sometimes, however, the slaves were remiss in providing chamber pots in the first place. So we do have one wonderful inscription from Pompeii carved on the wall of a bedroom by a guest who has wet the bed in the middle of the night, we assume. And he writes, well, I'm sorry about that, but there wasn't any chamber pots, so what did you expect me to do? Chamber pots, in addition to being emptied into the cesspit, were sometimes just emptied directly out the window. And this is an especial problem in insulae or apartment buildings where if you don't have a drop toilet, perhaps you don't want to walk the full chamber pot and its contents all the way down to the bottom floor to dump it. So you just throw it out the window instead. In fact, this was so common, so prevalent, that our Roman law compilation called the Digest has an entire section on liability when things are poured or thrown out of windows. How much you can get for such and such an object being thrown at you, what happens if it's a fatality, etc.